your evening with us. We got a great speakers tonight. They will be talking about Kansas LGBTQ politics. We have Thomas Witt, Executive Director of Equality Kansas, and we have author CJ Janovy. Tonight is one of many workshops that we will be hosting throughout the week. Tomorrow morning, we have at noon, we have They're Enemies of the State, which is about the Nazi persecution of the LGBTQ community during the Holocaust. Tomorrow night, we have a mental health workshop at 7 o'clock. And then Thursday, we have our LGBTQ history workshop at noon, followed by that evening, we have both of our panelists back today from today's event for a panel of Kansas LGBTQ activists. And then Friday, we have an intersectionality workshop at noon, followed by a project Q&A hangout on Zoom. So visit our Facebook event to register for that. And then on Saturday is the main event, which starts at 6:30, and we're featuring performers, musicians, drag artists, guest speakers, so you won't want to miss any of our events. But tonight's event is all about Kansas LGBTQ politics, and without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers tonight.
Thank you, Brandon. Good to be here. Sorry we can't be doing in-person Pride this year. We had to do the same thing for Wichita Pride. We canceled all of our in-person events and did some virtual events. But I think maybe next year we'll be able to get together in person, which is always a lot of fun.
Hopefully.
And thank you, Brandon, and hello to everyone who's watching. Like Tom, I'm sorry that we can't be there in person, but we're going to do our best here tonight. And I think maybe Tom, I'll just explain a little bit about who I am and why I'm here, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so first of all, I'm excited that Tom and I will both be back on Thursday night. We'll be joined by a couple other folks. I'm a journalist I'm based in Kansas City, but I've spent a lot of time reporting in Kansas, and I actually wrote a book about activism in Kansas, and it's called No Place Like Home: Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. And Tom was one of the people who I spent quite a bit of time with talking about activism in general, but specifically political activism and elections and policy. And so I'm going to try and recreate some of the best of that, those interviews here for y'all tonight. And so, Tom, can you start out by talking about the most recent big news statewide? Just last month, the Kansas Human Rights Commission made a major, what do you say, a policy change? Can you explain what happened?
Well, so let's rewind a couple of months back to June, when the United States Supreme Court issued its Bostock ruling, where it said that Equal Opportunity Commission's definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity was in fact constitutional. That case, which most of you who are watching tonight have probably heard about.
Actually, can I ask you to recap just the very basics of that case in case people haven't been up to date with it?
Yeah. So there were a number of plaintiffs who got caught up in lawsuits because they had lost their jobs because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the Supreme Court ruled, that the Title VII of the U.S. Civil Rights Act, as enforced by the Equal Opportunity Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, included sexual orientation and gender identity within the definition of sex. That discrimination based on sex included discrimination based on sexual orientation and included discrimination based on gender identity and expression. Now, we all know about the marriage ruling from 5 years ago, where in the Obergefell case, the Supreme Court said that marriage is a fundamental right and that it should be open to all consenting pairs of adults. the EEOC ruling in Bostock in this last June, was not a declaration of fundamental rights. It was a dispute over how the EEOC interpreted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And the Supreme Court said that the EEOC's interpretation was the correct one. Now, there's a lot of protections that gives us, but those protections are also limited. The EEOC only regulates companies with 40 or more employees. So if, like most of us, you work for a smaller business that has fewer than 40 employees, you weren't going to be covered by the Bostock ruling, which is a real important thing for everybody here in Kansas to know. So, and also the civil rights, or the Title VII does not cover public accommodations, and it doesn't cover housing discrimination. Okay, it only covers employment discrimination. Now, here in Kansas, we have the Kansas Act Against Discrimination, and it's a whole chapter in the statute books about how people can't be discriminated against in employment, in housing, in other words, rental, or even, getting a mortgage, and in public accommodations, being served at restaurants, being seen by doctors, any place where the general public can go and do business. And we have been, Equality Kansas has been trying for the past 15 years, to add sexual orientation and gender identity to our state non-discrimination laws. What happened last month is the agency that enforces our state non-discrimination laws, the Kansas Human Rights Commission, looked at the Bostock ruling from June and said, Kansas is now going to accept that ruling that includes sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the definition of sex. It's going to include that definition and apply it to the Kansas Act Against Discrimination as well. And why that is such a huge deal for us is, one, the Kansas Act Against Discrimination covers companies with 4 or more employees rather than 40 or more employees. So basically, in everything except the smallest mom and pop operations, queer workers are now protected from discriminatory behavior on the part of their employers. It also applies to housing. The Kansas Act Against Discrimination, anybody who's renting out more than 2 units, if it's just somebody renting out their grandmother apartment in the backyard or something like that, or their basement apartment, it doesn't apply to them. But anybody who rents out more than 2 units, they are covered by the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. So LGBTQ people can no longer be evicted for who we are or how we identify. And then the public accommodation part is probably, at its core, the most important part of this ruling, because public accommodations is the motivation behind originally including public accommodations in the Kansas Act Against Discrimination was to wipe out the vestiges of Jim Crow as it existed here in Kansas in the 50s and 60s, where African American and Black people couldn't be served at the same places that everybody else could be served, where they couldn't do business at the same places everybody else could do business. And we've seen a lot of attempts here in Kansas to make it hard for LGBT people to do business. We see these so-called religious objection or religious freedom bills that would say somebody can deny service to you because of your religion, or because of their religion. But these things are really aimed at the LGBT community. So when we look at the combination of Bostock in June, which applies at the federal level, and then our interpretation locally here in Kansas by our state government, this is a big step forward for us. And I think every LGBTQ person in Kansas should celebrate that we now are going to have those discrimination protections. The only caveat that I'll add to that is our state legislature could pass a law that says, no, the Kansas Human Rights Commission can't include sexual orientation and gender identity in their definition of sexual discrimination. So, we're not done with this fight yet. not by any means.
Help me understand that though, Tom. So if the Kansas Human Rights Commission is making its determination based on a Supreme Court ruling, how can the legislature then reverse what most of us think is national law now?
Because again, in Bostock, the controversy wasn't about a fundamental right. The controversy was about the interpretation of a statute. And the way you change the interpretation of a statute is to pass a new statute saying this is how it's to be interpreted. Okay. And so the legislature can do that. Also, we're almost certainly going to see litigation over the next few years over the KHRC, the Kansas Human Rights Commission's interpretation of the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. The far right will be looking for ways to get into the courthouse and sue to overturn KHRC's decision from last month.
Okay. Before I continue, Brandon, are you seeing any questions that we should answer at this point?
None at the moment. I did have one though. So if they don't challenge it and say we elect a different governor, will that change the ruling? Or
So the Kansas Human Rights Commission is an independent commission, and the board, the commissioners, are appointed by the governor, and some other people have that are in state government also have the ability to appoint members to the commission. But a commissioner's term is, I think, 6 years. So, you know, any one commissioner is going to outlast any one governor who appoints them. And right now, we've got at least one commissioner who goes all the way back to Bill Graves' administration. You know, there's commissioners right now that are on there from Graves, Sebelius, Brownback, and our current governor, Laura Kelly. And the interesting thing about the commission's decision last month is even though there are some rather conservative Republicans on the commission, the vote was unanimous. I found that very surprising.
So the journalist in me wants to stop and, you know, whenever someone says they found something surprising, I always want to know why. What was surprising about that? Was it just because it was unanimous because there were some Republicans on there, or was it because you're, you know, always braced for, you know, difficulty?
Well, I'll give you the answer journalists hate. Yes. Okay. And to elaborate, you know, not all Republicans are created equal. Some are more conservative than others, and some are just downright nuts. And not all Democrats are created equal either. We've certainly had our share of Democratic officials in this state who have gone out of their way to keep discrimination going. But, you know, I found it surprising, as you kind of alluded to, just because I'm always braced for the worst. I've been at this for 16 years now. And just because of the makeup of the commission, I figured there'd be at least one or two dissents, and there were none.
And do you think that's because people get it now, or because they were just not ready to fight that day?
You know, and maybe it's my cynicism and having been in this business for a while, but I don't try to understand why some of these people make the decisions they do. But when we get one that's good for us, I'm just appreciative, and I send them all a little thank you note saying, thanks for your support.
Okay, well, I won't question that either then. Tom, so what else is going on around the state then?
Well, so as far as, you know, non-discrimination work goes, since, you know, we started our campaign for local non-discrimination ordinances at the municipal level in our cities back in 2010. We had an ordinance passed in Manhattan. We worked with the Flint Hills Human Rights Project up in Manhattan. They were the leaders on getting that passed in 2011. But a new city council came in after it passed and immediately repealed it. We had ordinances passed in Hutchinson and Salina in 2012 that within 6 months of their passage were repealed by local ballot measures. But then in 2014, we passed a local non-discrimination ordinance in the small bedroom community of Roland Park, which is just outside of Kansas City, Missouri. It's on our side of the state line. It's about 10,000 people. It's a pretty small place. And the repeal efforts there in 2015 failed completely. And we built on that success, and we now have non-discrimination ordinances in 21 cities and counties in Kansas. Of the 3 million people that live here, 1.1 million live in a place where there's a non-discrimination ordinance that is fully inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. So, we've been making progress at the local level. And that progress, I think, probably influenced the Human Rights Commission when they made their decision last month. I think they looked at the landscape and saw that, look, this is where the world is now, and we just need to catch up.
So based on that, based on all of those ordinances, and then the statewide Human Rights Commission decision this summer, is there a need to continue to try for these local ordinances? Like, there's not one in Wichita, correct?
No, there was one that did not include sexual orientation up until Christmas Eve of 1999. And the city council in Wichita very quietly repealed their local ordinance. And there were people in the city attorney's office as recently as the beginning of this decade who did not realize it was no longer on the books. That's how quietly it was done. But when cities pass their local non-discrimination ordinances, they can make them more strict than what's in state law. State law allows cities to pass local non-discrimination ordinances that are tougher than the statewide law is. And when you've got a local human rights commission or human relations committee, however it's constituted and whatever it's called, that's made up of local people and local activists and local leaders, they're a lot more effective at combating discriminatory practices than a commission that meets weekly in Topeka. Okay. So, passing these local measures means something to the people who live in those communities.
And what's the status of, and maybe Brandon, you can chime in here, but what's the status of any thinking about such ordinances in Southeast Kansas? I'm sorry if I don't know if you guys can hear my dogs, but I'm hoping that they settle down here. Sorry. Local ordinances in Southeast Kansas.
Is that directed at me? Sorry.
It's directed at anyone who knows anything about whether there's a possibility, whether there's thinking or an effort, or not now.
I do know that I think Pittsburgh might have passed something recently. I've been a little swamped, so I'm not fully aware of the current events in Southeast Kansas, but I think Pittsburgh, Kansas passed something recently, and hopefully here locally we can, Project Q&A can work to get some things on the books as well. That's our future goals anyways.
I'm not sure the Pittsburgh ordinance passed. I think it was proposed, but then I think there were some losses in the last city elections in 2019 that kind of took the motivating people off the Pittsburgh City Commission. That's my understanding.
So if there were people watching that would like to try to get this passed in their town, what would your advice be for those people?
So, now I'll talk about Equality Kansas for a little bit and the work we do around the state. We have chapters in many of the major communities in Kansas. Right now, we've got active chapters in Kansas City, both in Wyandotte, Leavenworth counties, and then in Johnson County. We've got a chapter in Topeka, there's one in Salina, there's one in Wichita, there's one in Hutch, and there's one that's reforming in Northwest Kansas. Excuse me. And that we've had chapters pretty much everywhere, but as volunteers come and go, chapters kind of come and go because they're all locally led and volunteer led. But what those chapters are able to do is build that community support to pass these local ordinances. And then here at the state office in downtown Wichita, where I am right now, we provide a lot of legal, technical, and logistical support. If somebody needs help drafting an ordinance, depending on the structure of your city government, we can come up with 2 or 3 different drafts that might fit different budget and enforcement choices that a city might want. We can help you strategize on, how to approach your city council or commission, how to get this stuff passed, what some of the best practices are for enforcement, because we've got experience in dealing with this around the state. And it's always easiest for us and we're more effective if we can work through local chapters. Now, I know we did have a chapter that was centered down in Pittsburgh back in 2010, 2011, and 2012, but the people who were leading it, they moved out of state, and without leadership, the chapter kind of, disappeared on us. But if there are people down in Southeast Kansas, whether it's Independence, or Parsons or Pittsburgh or Fort Scott, or any of the communities down there that are interested in starting a chapter, we'd absolutely be happy to talk to them. The other thing that we're starting on now is passing, bans on conversion therapy at the local level. We've introduced conversion therapy bans in the legislature, but our legislature is led by crazy people. And those crazy people never let our bills get anywhere. So we're starting locally now, and we've been working with Trevor Project, which is the national suicide prevention organization that focuses on LGBTQ youth. We've gotten an ordinance passed in Roland Park, and I know we've got chapters working in other communities as well to pass conversion therapy bans.
Real quick, I had a couple questions. One question was, what happened to local ordinances if state legislation changes? And then also if you have a chapter in Southwest Kansas.
So we don't have an active chapter in Southwest Kansas right now, but if somebody wants to email me at witt@eqks.org, at WITT at EQ for equality, KS for Kansas.org, I definitely can help connect them to other people in their area who might want to help set a chapter up. And what was the other question? I'm sorry. What happens if state law changes?
Yeah, what happens to local ordinances if state legislation changes?
Okay, so changing state law is very hard. So let me just put that out there. Now, the Kansas Act Against Discrimination was first passed in, I'm going to say 1954, I believe. And it has been amended and expanded over the past, 65 years. And built into the Kansas Act Against Discrimination is cities are explicitly allowed to pass their own local ordinances via charter ordinance. And it would be real hard to pull that back out of the current statute. The law itself has been challenged in Kansas courts multiple times. And there are Supreme Court rulings here in Kansas that have very explicitly said that local municipalities with their local ordinances are absolutely permitted to have those local ordinances. I think probably my favorite Supreme Court case was the City of Hutchinson Human Relations Commission versus, some credit union that used to be there in Hutch. And the Supreme Court in their ruling said the first place to fight the scourge of discrimination is at the local level. So we've got some really strong Supreme Court rulings that protect these local ordinances. It's going to be real tough for the legislature to come along and pull that back. They tried in 2011 and 2012 to pass legislation that would restrict local ordinances, but we beat them both times. in the 2011 and 2012 session. So they've kind of given up on going after our local ordinances since we did that.
All the questions we have right now in the chat.
Okay.
Can I just sort of go back to the idea of starting a local chapter, or what a local chapter is able to accomplish, or how you would ask, how you would start working with City Hall to get one of these non-discrimination ordinances passed? In my experience in talking to activists and writing the book and watching what happened in Johnson County over the last 2 years, as many of the cities in Johnson County passed these ordinances, it doesn't take very many people working together to get one of these efforts rolling. One of the things that I really noticed as I talked to activists all around Kansas is sometimes it's just like 3 or 4 people in a chapter. You always wish that there were a lot. You always wish there were a lot of people involved. But what I've really noticed at the local level is it only takes just a very few people who are really committed to seeing something through. And then sort of once you get the ball rolling, and if you can get your city commission or your city council to just discuss this, and then people begin to come out to city council meetings and talk about it. And I think one of the things that I have noticed and written about and reported on is just how that begins to change people's minds. And so if you have weeks of testimony at City Hall about a non-discrimination ordinance, and all these people start coming out and telling their stories about their own lives and the lives of their families, their children, their neighbors, it really starts this community conversation that can be very difficult at times, but hugely educational and I think transformative in some cases, literally, if you get a law on the books, but also just in the amount of awareness that a community begins to have.
So, going back to the mid 2000s, when we first started Equality Kansas in 2005 and 6, and then we were lobbying in the legislature, I had legislator after legislator look at me and say, and I'm not making this up, I don't have your kind in my district. It's like, oh, for fuck's sake. Yes, you do have us in your district. We're everywhere, right? And so in 2009, 2010, we developed a deliberate strategy of picking these local ordinance fights in some of the smaller communities around Kansas, but there had to be a daily newspaper. Any place we were going to go, there needed to be a daily newspaper that was widely read in the community, because we knew that the best place for us to have this fight was going to be on the front page of the local paper. And you talk about just having a handful of people drive the effort. It starts small. Every chapter starts with that handful, 3 to 5 people. But they start getting out there and doing things, and people start hearing about it, and they do build the momentum. And we were having these fights in these local communities, and it was making the front page of the local paper 3 and 4 days a week sometimes. And that brought the passions out on both sides. But it was also an opportunity for us to educate the residents of these smaller cities and rural communities that, yes, you have LGBTQ people, not just in your county, not just in your city, not just on your block, but in the bedroom next door to you in your own home. A lot of people came out to their families through some of these fights. Excuse me. So, doing this kind of activism at the local level, it literally reaches into people's homes, and we do change hearts and minds this way. We did our political endorsements for the August primary. We released those in mid-July. And we got a lot of questions from, allies around the state. Why did you endorse this conservative Republican? Why did you endorse that right-wing Republican for election or re-election? And, our job both locally and at the state level, is to take these people who oppose equal rights for LGBT folks and convert them into supporters. So we have reached some of these people who were opposed to LGBTQ equality their entire lives, who have since learned that we're just as deserving of equal rights as anybody else, and they have switched from opponents to some of our most vocal supporters. That's what working at the local level does. When these legislators get to know people who live next door to them, who get to know their own family members, who get to know their own community leaders who are LGBTQ or have family members who are, then they become a lot more open to hearing what we're saying, and they become more sympathetic to the fact that we need to be treated with the same equal rights as everybody else.
Well, since you're talking, Tom, about state legislators, can you sort of give us the lay of the land of upcoming elections, since we're talking about endorsements?
Sure. And sorry, a little bit of history, because I know we've still got a little bit of time. We tried to run our first openly LGBT candidate in 2006. Up in Johnson County against Lance Kinzer. Her name was Honesty Jansen, and she ran against Lance Kinzer, who was writing some of the worst of the anti-LGBT legislation at the time. And she lost, of course. And then in 2008, Inga Taylor, a Black woman from here in Wichita, ran in a primary for a House seat, and she lost, unfortunately. In 2010, Dan Manning, a West Point graduate who was kicked out of the Army because of his sexual orientation, ran against Brenda Landwehr. And if any of you know who Brenda Landwehr is, oh, we really wanted Dan to win, but it was 2010 and there weren't Democratic wins anywhere in this state that year. 2012, did we run somebody? Yeah, we did. Jessica Peters ran against Lance Kinzer up in Johnson County. 2014, we had one LGBT candidate on the ballot. 2016, I don't think we had any out queers running in 2016. But then in 2018, we had Sharice Davids, who's now the Congresswoman for the 3rd Congressional District. We had Susan Ruiz, who now represents House District 23. And we had Brandon Woodard, who now represents District 30, which is Lance Kinzer's old seat. We finally got that seat. We wanted it bad for a long time. And, so we've been trying to get out LGBTQ people elected for a long time. And this year, we have our 2 incumbents on the ballot, plus 4 other openly LGBT candidates running for public office in the state. And I'll just start from the west. The furthest west is Ryan Holmquist up in Salina, and he is running for J.R. Clay's old House seat. And he's got a pretty good shot. He's raising money like a madman, and he's out campaigning every day. In Wichita, we have Stephanie Byers, who, if she is elected, will be the first openly transgender member of the Kansas legislature. She's a Native American former high school band and orchestra teacher who retired after 30 years in the classroom. There's in Emporia, there's Todd Maddox, who is running for House District 60 in a fairly Democratic seat, but he's running against a moderate Republican named Mark Schreiber, who has voted with the LGBT community every time a bill regarding us has come up. So I don't know how Todd's going to do, but we're rooting for him. And then in Johnson County, we've got Katie Dixon, who's an openly bi woman who's running for Scott Schwab's old House seat in southern Johnson County. And then, of course, Brandon and Susan are 2 incumbent Kansas legislators. And then, Sharice Davids is running for her congressional seat again. I think the most interesting thing about 2018 when Brandon and Charisse and Susan all won their races was how little talk there was about their sexual orientation in those campaigns. In every other campaign where we've had an out person from this community run, their sexual orientation has been a part of their opponent's strategy. And now we're to a point where it's almost not even being mentioned, and they're just attacking our LGBT candidates over whether it's school funding or Medicaid expansion or reopening Kansas. The fights have become more policy oriented rather than what we basically call gay baiting. It's the world's changed, and we've all been privileged to be here and help it and watch it change.
I have follow-up questions to that, but I want to see if Brandon has any on his end first.
We have one. What advice would you give to an openly LGBTQ person that's interested in running for a position in either local or state or national government?
Call me.
Perfect.
Because we've got about 10 minutes left here, right? It's not a conversation we can have in 10 minutes. But I've helped on an awful lot of campaigns around the state, both for LGBT people and for our straight allies. And there's a lot of work that goes into it, but if you get hooked up with somebody who knows what they're doing, it can be a lot of fun, and you can help change the world right here in Kansas.
I mean, if it's not too contradictory, Tom, to what you might say, I'm struck by that whole list of people that you named up until 2018. And so I think that really sort of recognizing how much groundwork has to be done ahead of time, how willing a person has to be to sort of put themselves out there and do the best they can and get the best advice they possibly can and raise as much money and work as hard and prepare to lose, but come back again the next time, or lay the groundwork for someone who runs the next time. Because if nobody ever runs, then you don't end up with data that shows where your friendly votes are. Is that a big part of it, Tom?
It is a huge part of it, and it's not just candidate campaigns where that's true. I'll go back to when we started in 09 and 10 our local ordinance campaigns. We knew we were going to get our asses kicked. We knew we were going to lose when we picked those fights in cities around the state. But the point wasn't to actually come out of it with an ordinance that didn't get overturned. The point then, it's a different strategy now, but the point a decade ago was to get on the map, get into the conversation, and educate the public. And the best way to educate the public about our issues is to have the fight on the front page of the local paper. Candidates who run, if they make enough noise, if they carry that, for queer candidates, they carry that rainbow or trans flag openly and proudly, they get covered in their local press, and their message reaches a lot more people than our message would have reached otherwise. And we do educate the public, and the public gets to know us not as a caricature, but they get to know us as human beings, as people. And that's how we've made the progress that we've made. And even though we know sometimes we're running a campaign that we're going to lose, we know we're going to have to accept that loss. It's never fun when it happens. Everybody's sad. There's tears. There's maybe a little more alcohol than there should be. But we know we're going to get up and dust ourselves off and go fight the next day. And it's that kind of effort that it takes. This is not an instant gratification business. This is something that you have to get in it and stay in it.
We have one more question real quick in the chat. What can allies do to help?
Well, so standing up and speaking for us in local city council meetings, standing up and speaking for us and alongside us in legislative hearings, contributing money. We're a nonprofit. We don't live, since we're a politically oriented nonprofit, we're not eligible for about 99.9% of the grants that are out there. We are completely dependent on community contributions. And this work does cost money to get done. And so those are three of the big ways that allies can support us. I will say that in 2018, Brett Hadel became chair of our Kansas City Metro chapter. And under his leadership, he doubled the number of Johnson County cities that had local ordinances. Our chapter there had already been making progress. And then when he came in, he helped double it. And now he's chair of our political action committee. And he's a straight ally and one of the most dependable allies anybody could ever want. So just being in our organization's leadership, there's a place.
How are we doing on time? Are we done? Do we have time for more questions, or?
We have time. There's no further questions in the chat at the moment. Another thing that I'm going to bring up real quick is Project Q&A is working with the Voter Network for their Equal Vote campaign to register voters. And CJ is actually going to be at their kickoff next week, I believe, on September 15th. So if you'd like more information on that, contact Project Q&A and you can help us register voters. If you have any more questions, please post them in the chat and I'll ask the speakers.
So while we're waiting, I'll just talk about my job. So half the year I live in Wichita. The other half of the year I live in Topeka. What I do in Topeka is I have a tiny little apartment 2 blocks from the Capitol. And I move in there every January. And while the legislature's in session, God only knows what they're going to stir up. And I'm in that state house every day, watching everything they're doing, trying to build relationships with legislators, including some of the most conservative people in that building. That's not always easy. When I first started lobbying in Topeka back in 05, my first few years there, legislators and the corporate lobbyists wouldn't even look me in the eye. I was shunned in the hallways, which is okay. I'm kind of a loner to begin with. So being ignored by people I couldn't stand, that was all right. But, you know, just having our community having a permanent presence in the State House, alongside, sadly, the Koch lobbyists, the Planned Parenthood lobbyists, the NAACP lobbyists, all the organizations that have a presence in the State House. We've been there since 2005, every year, every session, standing up for this community. And it's given us credibility that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Because again, these lawmakers and policymakers have gotten to know the community. Now, I don't know if we'll be doing it this coming year, but every January we have our Equality Day in either the 3rd or 4th week of January, where we invite LGBT people from around the state to come to the State House. We have a big luncheon, we have a rally, and then we have packets that people get to go and take to their state representatives and state senators and tell the ones that say, I ain't got none of you people in my district. You walk into their office and say, hi, I'm from your district and I'm here to talk to you. And we have changed, I'm not kidding, we have changed hearts and minds just by having those legislative visits over the years. Most recently, our past few equality days, it's been just packed with middle school and high school kids who have been coming into the State House. Our partner organization, Glisten, rents buses and gets kids to sign up and bring them in. And having all those adorable kids running around the State House for an entire day, they go and they talk to these legislators, and they get across to these lawmakers that these kids need to be protected.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I do want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers, Tom and CJ. Thank you for spending your evening with us and helping raise awareness for the LGBTQ community living here in Kansas. Thank you for all that you do. And we look forward to seeing you guys Thursday night as well.
Thank you, Brandon, and thanks to whoever tuned in on Facebook. I hope this is helpful.
Thanks, everybody.